Let us pray. Our God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight this morning. Well, welcome to Kickoff Week. This past week, we started our new fall scheduling with new opportunities for our youth through fellowship and music and education, and we returned to the programming and the activities that create the hum of the church, which have fallen a little silent during the summer months. The choir is back in session, adult education opportunities abound, and mission activities are in full swing. What a great time. What a great time for us to be reminded that every time we come together, whether it's 2 or 22 or 2002, Jesus is among us. Jesus promises his presence in our gatherings, even when it's just a few of us, because it makes what we do more than what we do. Yes, there is indeed great comfort in believing Jesus when he says, I am there among you. Now, Jesus' words here in Matthew are every bit the truth of God with us, Emmanuel, that we need to hear. And we need to hear these words often. In the United States, for the victims of Hurricane Harvey, these words simply must be repeated over and over again as the funerals begin for those lost to the storm, as they continue the cleanup, as they look at months, years of working toward restoring the lives that they once had. For the 800,000 dreamers that feel they no longer have a country to call home, they need to hear these words. And for the millions that have been affected and will be affected by Hurricane Irma, they need to hear these words. And globally, the world is on pins and needles as dictators flex their muscle with atomic bombs. And we all need to be assured that Christ is with us during the craziness and the chaos. Sometimes all that is necessary to be the church, to do church, is to call upon Matthew 18:20 and take Jesus at his word. At the same time, Jesus showing up is not always good news, at least for some. Ask Joel Osteen. The promise of Jesus' presence, for where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am there among them, is comfort. Only insofar as we are comfortable with Jesus being that close. And I suspect that some of us, all of us, some of the time, if we're honest, don't always want Jesus in such immediate proximity. Where we shop, the neighborhoods where we buy homes, our decisions to turn some people into friends and others into enemies, some into heroes and others into terrorists, might look differently if we truly thought Jesus is present during those decisions, asking ourselves, what would Jesus think of this choice? Might make us choose differently. Sadly, it appears that a lot of what happens in churches goes on without thinking about Jesus' words at all, either intentionally ignoring them or choosing ambivalence. We assume them rather than rely on them. And we take them for granted rather than ask ourselves, what difference does it make that Jesus is in the midst of everything that we do as a community? Everything that we talk about, every decision we make. Maybe our mantra should not just be, what would Jesus do, but what would Jesus think? Now, these days, there is ample evidence to suggest that many congregations, so-called coalitions, and church committees carry on with ecclesial business as if Jesus weren't in the room. Either they've forgotten Matthew 18:20, or they prefer not to listen to Jesus this time around. Because if they really thought that Jesus was telling the truth, that Jesus overhears their discussions and their decisions, that Jesus is sitting there at the table as they draft statements that call for the condemnation of LGBTQIA plus people, perhaps just for a moment, there would be a minute of pause, a hint of hesitation. Perhaps they would think twice and ask themselves whether or not they actually believe Jesus when he said, "He's with us always." It seems these days a good number of things said about God assume God can't hear what is being said about God. That God is not in the room. Emmanuel is not always God that we want. This God who insists on staying close, persists in being in the middle of what we do and say, especially when it comes to those things that we do and say in God's name. There are many ways that we can imagine God and who God is. But when who God is ends up being where God is, well, that's theology that's better left in theology books, gathering dust in the library. Because a God whose primary identity is God that is among us. Well, that's a God that we won't be able to pin down, to systematize, and to control. We can't box that God in. No, Emmanuel is often far more difficult to confess than we're willing to admit. No wonder Jesus will be making this same promise again at the end of this same gospel. And remember, I am with you always to the end of the age. So maybe before we get caught up in what fall always brings, we should write down Jesus' words on a post-it note and put it someplace prominent. Maybe make our screensaver these words on our computer, or set our phone alarm for the same time each day to remind us that more often than not, people will attempt to put Emmanuel aside in favor of efficiency or ease or the bottom line. Yes, we need to remember Jesus' promise, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am among you, and take it seriously and live accordingly. Remembering will remind us that we are a community of faith that is called to be different than the Rotary or the Kiwanis. Remembering that Jesus is in our midst will remind us that we are to be in solidarity with one another as children, avoiding actions that cause others to stumble, caring for the most vulnerable, and restoring those who go astray, and forgiving without limit. When we are in our committee meetings, a council meeting, fellowship time, adult Bible study, Jesus is there among us. When we're making decisions about where our benevolence will go or whom our church will welcome, Jesus is there among us. When our church questions if it will speak up or stay silent, Jesus is there among us. And when we are discussing our vision and our mission, our future, Jesus is there among us. Don't forget. Others have, and as a result we have churches, institutions, and leaders claiming to be Christian and yet trying to fly solo. And to this I can only say, I wonder, what would Jesus think? Amen.